Well, welcome back to our read through the Bible. Today we're picking up in Joshua chapter 9. Now let's just do a little bit of reviewing. Okay, remember in the first 8 chapters of the book of Joshua, Joshua leads the children of Israel across the Jordan River into the promised land, and the first conquest they have is the walled city of Jericho. But remember, after Jericho, Achan sinned against God, so the second attack Israel makes is against a smaller place called Ai. 36 Israelites are defeated. Joshua is utterly distraught, and God says, deal with the sin in the camp. And they found out that a man named Achan had disobeyed God in relation to the garments and the gold and the silver. He had taken them and hidden them. So he is killed. God's judgment is strong. God is holy and righteous. Then they're able to defeat Ai. So Israel kind of establishes this stronghold in central Canaan. Well, as you pick up in chapter 9, you have an interesting story here, the story of the Gibeonites. Now, the Gibeonites are one of the Canaanite tribes. They're actually Hivites, and they live in Canaan. This city and these people under the ban, they are going to be or should be killed. But at any rate, the guile of the Gibeonites is kind of this story. And so they dress up in old clothes, old bread, all this stuff, and they act like they've been on a very far journey, and they come to Gilgal, to the camp of Joshua, and they said, make a covenant with us. We're not from the land. We're from a great distance. Israel could make covenants and agreements with nations and peoples outside of the land of Canaan. All of Canaan was under the ban. They were to be eradicated so they would not have a negative influence on God's people. So Joshua and Israel makes this mistake. They don't consult the Lord, but they wind up making this agreement, this covenant with the Gibeonites. Shortly after it, they discover that the Gibeonites had lied. All this was a ruse, and they couldn't kill them. They couldn't destroy them because they had already made this covenant or agreement with them, but they do make them slaves. They become woodcutters and water drawers. Well, as you jump into chapter 10, and this actually goes back into chapter 9, all the kings of southern Canaan are afraid, and they're led by a man named Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem. This is way before Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel. And so he, along with the king of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, after they hear about the Gibeonites making peace with Israel, they attack Gibeon. They are petrified of what Israel is doing. So Gibeon sends emissaries down to Gilgal to Joshua, tells him what has happened. God tells Joshua, be courageous, go up, fight against the Canaanites that have attacked Gibeon. So they go up, and God allows them to have a great victory. And as they are fleeing, 2 amazing miracles occur. First of all, hailstone comes down from the sky and actually kills more of this Canaanite coalition of these 5 kings than actually were killed by the swords of the Israelites. And so they run, and you have a second miracle in which God makes the sun stand still. Joshua just prays for more time, and God makes the sun stand still over the valley of Ahijalon so they can complete this defeat of these 5 kings. And in the meantime, these 5 kings wind up hiding in a cave, and the Israelites put stones in front of the caves. And the reason why is they could not stop pursuing the armies. They didn't want them to get back into these fortified cities that would make it very difficult later on to deal with them. So the Israelites defeat all of these nations, come back and kill these 5 kings that have gone into the cave at Makkedah. So Israel takes all of southern Palestine, all the area to the south. Well, now you've got the central campaign. Jericho and Ai have been defeated. You've got the southern campaign. These 5 kings, led by the king of Jerusalem, have now been defeated. So naturally, they turn their attention to the north. Now, the most significant city in the north, and you get this as you jump into chapter 11. The most significant city in the north is a city called, it looks like it's Hazor, H-A-Z-O-R. It's actually pronounced Hatzor. And the king of Hatzor was a man named Jabin. Now, he leads a coalition of northern kings when he hears of all that Israel had done in the central campaign and the southern campaign. And so he brings them to a place called the Waters of Merriman. And the Bible describes the people that Jabin, the king of Hatzor, has, so numerous as the sand of the seashore. Many horses, chariots, this massive army. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid. Remember this refrain again and again in the book of Joshua. Be courageous. Do all that I've told you to do. God says, tomorrow I will deliver them into your hands, and they will fall slain before you. You will hamstring their horses and burn their chariots. So Israel does a surprise attack on this coalition led by Jabin, the king of Hatzor, at the Waters of Merriam. He'd gathered all the kings of the north. They defeat them, destroy Hatzor, they pursue the enemies, and this time the Bible says they're allowed to take Israel as the cattle as slaughtered. Remember in Jericho, everything was under the ban. So Joshua takes the whole land and most of the giants. Now, some of the Anakim, the giants, are going to be left in the area of the Philistines. Remember Goliath of Gath, one of the Philistine cities, kind of interesting story there. We'll get to that later on. So you come into chapter 12, and in chapter 12 is interesting because it tells us of all the kings that have been defeated by Joshua. It actually goes back to begin with some that Moses had defeated. Remember Og and Sihon, the two Amorite kings on the eastern side of the Jordan River before they came across the river. Moses was involved in that. Moses, of course, did not enter the promised land, but it begins with those two kings. Then describes the kings that were killed in the central campaign, described in Joshua chapter 7 and 8. That would have been the king of Jericho, the king of Ai, some of that. And then it describes the southern kings in verses 10 through 16 of chapter 12. Remember, those were the five kings of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Lachish, Debir, and some others. Then describes the kings in the north. So it lists all of these kings that were taken in chapter 12. So this is a list of all of the kings that were taken. Very interesting list. Then you come over into chapter 13. And in chapter 13, Joshua is now very old. He started his leadership actually when he was 90. He's going to die at 110. But God tells him this, that there's very much land that still remains to be possessed. Now, they had killed all these kings and taken all these great cities, but there are areas outside of the fighting that there are still a lot of the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Hivites, Girgashites, these 7 cities, Jebusites, large pockets outside of the invasion of the central, the south, and the north. And in particular, the Bible describes some of these areas. A lot of them around the Philistine areas, kind of over in the southwest, and then up in the north there's a lot, but they're actually kind of scattered throughout the land of Canaan. And so Canaan is about to be divided among the 9.5 tribes. The 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, have been given their inheritance on the east side. And remember the command, go in and lead your brothers. And that's what these 2.5 tribes did. Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. They act as the shock troops. Now remember, the tribe of Levi, they're not going to get a tribal inheritance. If you look on a map, you don't see the tribe of Levi there. That's because they're given 48 Levitical cities. And chapter 13, let me just say this. As you come to chapter 13, you're coming to a new section because chapters 1 through 12 talk about how they took the land. Chapters 13 and following talk about how the land is divided. Well, chapter 14 is interesting because you have a man here come forward, and they're meeting, Eleazar the priest, Joshua, and the heads of the 10 tribes, and they're about to give the 9.5 tribes their land. Remember, the 2.5 tribes have their land on the other side, and the Levites have the cities, and they're about to divide all of this up by lot, and Judah's to go first, but Caleb comes forward before any of this happens, and he said, hey, I'm 85 years old. God promised me And he goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 36, that he would give me the land where my feet walked upon. Remember, the two spies that were faithful at Kadesh Barnea, who were they? Joshua and Caleb. Well, Caleb's 85 years old. And he said, I'm still able to go in and come out. I want what was promised to me by God. And so Hebron and the area around Hebron is given to him. And he's 85 years old. There's even giants in that area, but Caleb's going to drive him out. Great story of Caleb and how he was faithful to God. And he remembered the promises that God made. And you can remember the promises that God makes to you. And you can realize that they will be fulfilled. So Caleb came forward, and he's given the land as God promised him because of his faithfulness. Now, if you get into chapter 15, 16, and 17, what you have here is that the land given to Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh is talked about. In 15, it describes Judah. It begins kind of describing the boundary of Judah. It's kind of impossible to retrace all of this stuff, but anyway, it describes the boundary of the area that Judah is going to be given, kind of south of the Dead Sea, over to the Mediterranean, kind of up over, just kind of north of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's kind of interesting because the tribal inheritance of Benjamin, we'll get into that later, Benjamin and Judah kind of almost go right through the center of Jerusalem. Some very interesting things there. So, and then it redescribes in Joshua 15 kind of the area given to Caleb. This is in Judah. And it describes also his daughter that he gives to a man named Othniel. As you read that, you want to mark that, because he would be one that would drive out some of the giants in the land. Then it gives kind of an exhaustive list of the cities and the territories of Judah. Now, one thing to remember about this is that Jerusalem is now under the control of a tribe called the Jebusites, and they will not be driven out until David's time. In chapter 16, Ephraim's tribal inheritance is given to them. Remember, these two tribes of Joseph are next in line. And Joseph is given a double portion. Usually go to the firstborn. Remember, Reuben had forfeited the right because back in Genesis 35, Reuben had sexual relations with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. So because he violated that, the birthright is taken away from him, and the birthright is given to Ephraim. And then chapters 5 through 9 describes Ephraim's boundaries. But it tells us something here about Ephraim and about a number of these tribes, and that is that there were still Canaanites in the area around Gezer that needed to be dispossessed. So this is going to be a thorn in Israel's flesh, because all these talk about these areas that they still need to drive them out. Then in chapter 17, Manasseh. Remember the double portion given to Joseph? Well, the two sons of Joseph. That's why when you look at a map, a lot of times you will not see a tribe of Joseph. Joseph has two tribes. What are the tribes of Joseph? They're Ephraim and Manasseh, his two sons. So 17 describes the tribal inheritance of Manasseh. Now, remember, Manasseh, if you look at it, half of Manasseh is on the west side of the Jordan River in the land of Canaan. Half of the tribe of Manasseh is on the east side. And the oldest of Manasseh's sons, Machir, he is the one that gets the east side, and the rest of the sons are in the west side. It goes in it reminds us also of, again, the daughters of Zelophehad. This is the son of Machir on the east side, that they will keep their tribal inheritance even though there's only daughters, not a son, so the name of their father will not be removed. Then describes the boundaries of Manasseh in verses 7 through 18 of chapter 17. And it's kind of interesting that both Ephraim and Manasseh complain, we need more land, not enough land, and we have a lot of Canaanites still left in the land. So Joshua says, clear the forests and drive out the Canaanites, and you will have enough land. So kind of as you come to the end of chapter 17, the land has been divided for these three tribes and for the tribes on the east side of the Jordan River. It's fascinating as we read God's word. God gives us clarity and understanding of what he's doing. Read the Bible. I hope that you have more understanding. I hope that your biblical IQ, and pray that your biblical IQ is increasing greatly. God bless you, and remember, read the Bible.